My father was born in a town in Russia, now Ukraine, by the name of Kovel in 1910. By age 19, around 1929, two of his brothers already had come to Mexico. One of them was running from the army. Actually, he had been in prison and was slated to be executed for crimes that I'm not totally clear what they were. And they managed to somehow bribe one of the jailers. He escaped, went to Mexico, established a factory of socks. Boyfort was the name of the factory. And then his older brother came in, Gersh. And then my father got there in about 1929 at the age of 19. And of course he stayed in Mexico.
Well, my parents were both from Poland. They decided to get married, and by that time, most of my mother's family was here already. Siblings, that is, had emigrated, and they couldn't come here because the immigration laws were so tight. By then, you had to wait years to get a visa, get in, and all that. And they had friends that were going to Argentina, so they both decided to go to Argentina, where immigration was encouraged at the time. There was a massive Polish immigration.
I understand that in the 1920s, if I remember correctly, there was actually an attempt from Mexico to bring Europeans into Mexico with the belief that that will help stimulate the economy, and they would bring culture, they would bring knowledge and other things like that. So there was a relatively open immigration policy into Mexico in the early part of the century. So while the U.S. was clamping down on immigrants, Mexico was actually opening up their doors to Europeans, and there was no issue about Jews coming in.
As a matter of fact, my mother, who was 24, was told that her age was a little too young. They might give her a hard time, and it had to do with white slavery and prostitution at the time. Women were being brought over for purposes of prostitution, and somehow even 24 was too old, too young. And so she had somebody, my mother retold this to me, but I believe it because her documents then were changed by somebody she knew in the document office to make her like 3 years older. So ever since then, instead of 1906, her birthday was 1909. Who, I had no way of knowing whether that was, I know that's true, but whether they were being overly cautious or not, it didn't matter. But they made it, and they had a number of friends that went with them to Buenos Aires, and they lived in Argentina for 17 years, and that's where my brother and I were born. And they had a tough life there early on. It was the Depression, the early 30s, and my father had a number of jobs selling to the gauchos out in the Pampas, peddling and coming back. Eventually he got it, he became a weaver. He was taught the trade, and there was a big textile industry in Argentina, in Buenos Aires specifically. And it became to be a good job, a skilled job as a weaver.
We were going to Spain. We went to Bilbao. Why Bilbao? Because Bilbao is a port city, and there were ships leaving. Oh, before we left, a small item, before we left Nice, my dad obtained a visa either to Venezuela or Nicaragua, I forget which. It was one of the Central American cities, because that's the only way. You had to have a visa to somewhere in order to be viable. So, and also by then, how he knew that, I don't know. But there was a budding diamond industry in Havana by then, in Cuba. So people who hadn't been able to go anywhere had sort of settled in Cuba. There were Europeans who had created a factory, and it could have been that was before our war. It could have been from other places, but at any rate, so the aim was to get to Havana and then go to the UN from there. We were in Bilbao a couple of weeks. My parents were trying to get passage on a ship that would go at this point to Havana and then to wherever they're, although they didn't intend to go there, but they needed the visa to get on that ship. We left Bilbao sometime it must have been the fall of 1941, and stopped in Vigo, picked up some other people, and then started out. This was a Spanish ship, excuse me, with a big Spanish flag painted on the top. So, because the Spains were friends of the Germans, so, and we were moving very far south to avoid U-boats in the Atlantic. And we started out going pretty slowly. I think it took a total of about 2 weeks to cross what the Queen Mary does in 3 days.
I was born in Riga, Latvia, on September 16, 1921. That makes me an old man. My mother, in Riga, where she was born, her mother was alive, and she had 7 brothers and sisters. They all came to the United States, except my mother. And they sent her money to come to the United States. But she got married there. And when they wanted to come to the United States had closed the doors. No more immigration. So what do? They didn't want to stay in Latvia. So they decided to go to South America.
So my mother became very scared, and a couple of days later she wrote to her brother in Mexico telling him, get me out of here. So months later she got a visa and she gets into the train station in Warsaw, and she's assigned a compartment where there were other people already traveling in that compartment because the train had started from someplace else. And this was a family of a man and a wife and a 2-year-old child with no hair, a girl with no hair. She was probably, somebody shaved her hair. And they were coming, they looked like rural, that they came from rural. They were also traveling to Mexico. Well, it happens that the mother of that girl was the sister of my father. So, and they had to travel for 1 month together because they traveled from Warsaw to Danzig, and then in Danzig everybody took a boat to the French port of Le Havre, and from Le Havre another boat to Mexico with a stopover in Havana. And so they had to travel for a whole month. So even though they didn't like each other because my mother was from the urban context and the other people were from the rural context, it must have happened that my aunt, when she came to Mexico, told my father, which was a bachelor, here there is a good catch. And sure enough, about a year later, or a year and a half later, my mother marries this gentleman in 1937. So this is an interesting story of the way that both of them met.